Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing and enigmatic cases to ever emerge from the isolated mountains of early 20th century America. I'm your host, and tonight we delve into a story that has haunted researchers, historians, and local communities for over a century. Before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about exploring these dark chapters of history in the dead of night, wouldn't you agree? The year is 1912. The place, the remote hills of Harlan County, Kentucky, deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. This is a land of dense forests, winding dirt roads, and communities so isolated that news from the outside world could take weeks to arrive. It's a place where families lived by their own rules, where the law was a distant concept, and where secrets could be buried as deep as the coal in the mountains. In September of that year, a traveling merchant named Thomas Pritchard was making his monthly rounds through the backwoods settlements. He had a regular route that included the Whitlock property, a modest homestead situated nearly 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. The Whitlocks always needed supplies: flour, salt, kerosene, basic necessities for survival in such remote conditions. But when Pritchard arrived at the Whitlock cabin on September 14, 1912, he found something that would chill him to his core. The property was completely silent. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the autumn cold. The livestock, 3 goats and several chickens, were dead in their pen, apparently from starvation. The front door stood slightly ajar, creaking in the mountain wind. Pritchard called out. No response. He approached the cabin cautiously, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. When he pushed the door fully open, the smell hit him first. Not the smell of death, as one might expect, but something else. Something acrid and chemical, something burnt. The interior of the cabin was in disarray, furniture overturned, broken dishes scattered across the floor, and on the walls, scratched into the wood with what appeared to be a knife or sharp stone, were symbols. Strange, unsettling symbols that Pritchard couldn't identify. Some looked vaguely religious, others seemed older, more primitive. But the family was gone, all of them. Silas Whitlock, the 52-year-old patriarch, his 5 daughters, Ruth, Clara, Abigail, Esther, and young Lily. 7 people had simply vanished without a trace. Pritchard immediately rode to the county sheriff's office in Harlan, nearly a full day's journey. Sheriff William Dugan assembled a search party and arrived at the Whitlock property on September 16th. What they discovered over the following days would transform this from a simple missing persons case into something far more sinister, something that would echo through the decades as one of Kentucky's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. The official report filed by Sheriff Dugan on September 20th, 1912, now housed in the Harlan County Historical Archives, describes findings that raised more questions than answers. In the cabin's single bedroom, they found 5 straw mattresses, all stained with what appeared to be old blood. In the kitchen, they discovered a large, leather-bound Bible, open to the book of Genesis, specifically to the passages describing the sons of God and the daughters of men. But it was what they found in the root cellar that truly disturbed the investigators. We'll get to that shortly, because to understand the full horror of what happened at the Whitlock homestead, we first need to understand who these people were, how they lived, and what dark secrets had been festering in that isolated cabin for years before that September day in 1912. What the investigators would eventually piece together was not just a story of disappearance, but a chronicle of systematic abuse, genetic horror, and a family's descent into something that defied comprehension. This is the disturbing case of the Whitlock family and their cursed lineage. To understand the Whitlock family tragedy, we must first understand the world they inhabited. Harlan County, Kentucky, in the early 1900s, was a place shaped by isolation, hardship, and an almost medieval separation from the modernizing America beyond its mountain borders. The Appalachian region had always been a land apart. Following the Civil War, which had torn through Kentucky with particular brutality, many families retreated deeper into the mountains, seeking isolation from a rapidly changing world. By 1912, while cities like New York and Chicago were experiencing the heights of the progressive era, with electric lights, automobiles, and social reform movements, places like Harlan County remained stubbornly rooted in the 19th century, or even earlier. The Whitlock family had lived in these mountains for 3 generations. According to land records discovered in the Harlan County courthouse, Silas Whitlock's grandfather, Jeremiah Whitlock, had purchased 40 acres of mountain land in 1867 for the sum of $12. The property was nearly inaccessible, reached only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest and across 2 creek beds that became impassable during heavy rains. Silas Whitlock was born in 1860, the youngest son of Jeremiah and Rebecca Whitlock. Local church records from the Harlan Methodist Episcopal Church show that Silas married Martha Ann Cobb in 1887 when he was 27 and she was 23. The marriage was registered, but notably no wedding ceremony appears in the church records, suggesting it may have been a civil union, or, more likely given the remoteness of their location, simply a common law arrangement that was later formalized for legal purposes. Between 1888 and 1898, Martha gave birth to 5 daughters, no sons, in a culture that prized male heirs for heavy labor and family continuity. This was considered a misfortune. Ruth was born in 1888, followed by Clara in 1890, Abigail in 1893, Esther in 1896, and finally Lily in 1898. Each birth was recorded in the family Bible, the same Bible that would later be found open to those disturbing passages. The family lived by subsistence farming, corn, beans, potatoes, whatever could grow in the rocky Appalachian soil. They kept livestock, hunted deer and wild turkey, and relied on the seasonal visits of traveling merchants like Thomas Pritchard for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. It was a hard life, but not uncommon for the region. According to testimony later provided by neighboring families, the Whitlocks were known to be peculiar. They rarely attended church services despite the region's intense religious culture. When they did appear, usually only at Christmas and Easter, they kept to themselves. Several residents of the small community of Cranks, the nearest settlement about 7 miles away, reported that Silas Whitlock had grown increasingly paranoid over the years, speaking of corruption from the outside and the need to maintain purity. Reverend Augustus Blackwood, who served the Cranks Methodist Church from 1905 to 1918, kept detailed journals that survive today in the Kentucky Historical Society archives. In an entry dated November 3, 1909, he wrote, "Visited the Whitlock property today at the urging of concerned congregation members. Silas Whitlock met me at the boundary of his land, rifle in hand, and forbade me from approaching further. He spoke in a manner most agitated about false prophets and the defiling influence of strangers. I observed his daughters in the distance, all dressed in identical grey dresses, watching from the cabin windows. They appeared thin and pale. When I offered prayer and assistance, Silas became violent in his refusal and discharged his rifle into the air. I departed, deeply troubled." This was one of the last documented outside contacts with the Whitlock family before Martha's death. Martha Ann Whitlock died on January 12, 1910. The death certificate, filed weeks later by Silas himself during a rare trip to Harlan, listed the cause as pneumonia and complications. She was 48 years old. There was no funeral, no burial in the church cemetery. Silas claimed to have buried her on the property, though the exact location was never recorded. It was after Martha's death that the true darkness began, though no one outside the Whitlock cabin would know it for more than 2 years. The few neighbors who had any contact with the family noted changes. The Whitlock daughters, previously seen occasionally at the general store in Cranks, stopped appearing entirely. When Thomas Pritchard made his monthly supply deliveries, he reported that only Silas would meet him, usually halfway down the trail from the cabin. The supplies he requested began to change. More food than usual, strange requests for medical supplies including bandages and herbal remedies, and once, disturbing enough for Pritchard to mention it to the local doctor, a request for information about midwifery. "Something's wrong up there," Pritchard told Dr. Samuel Hendricks in the summer of 1911, according to Hendricks' personal correspondence. "Silas looks half mad. His eyes got this wild look, and I swear I heard crying coming from that cabin. Not adult crying, baby crying, but who could be having babies up there? Ain't no men but Silas for miles." Dr. Hendricks made a note to investigate, but the demands of his practice, which covered hundreds of square miles, delayed his visit. By the time he planned to make the journey in September 1912, the Whitlock family had already vanished. The mountains of Kentucky held many secrets in those days. Families lived and died in isolation, their stories known only to the hills and hollers. But what had been happening in the Whitlock cabin during those 2 years after Martha's death would prove to be something beyond the ordinary tragedies of poverty and hardship. It was something darker, something that would leave a stain on that land that, according to local legend, has never fully washed away. When Sheriff William Duggan and his deputy James Coulter, along with 4 volunteers from Cranks, arrived at the Whitlock property on September 16, 1912, they expected to find a family that had perhaps fled due to debt, illness, or some domestic dispute. What they found, instead, was evidence of something far more sinister. The official investigation report, written in Sheriff Duggan's careful hand and preserved in the Harlan County archives, begins with a description of the property's condition. The cabin itself was a single-story structure, roughly 30 feet by 20 feet, divided into 3 rooms. A main living area with a kitchen, a bedroom, and a small root cellar accessed by a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. The structure was solid, built from local timber, and showed no signs of forced entry or violent struggle from the outside. But inside, the story was different. In the main room, furniture had been overturned. A wooden table lay on its side, one leg broken. Chairs were scattered. Broken pottery and dishes littered the floor. The walls, as Pritchard had reported, were covered with symbols. Sheriff Duggan attempted to document these markings in his report, describing them as crude religious iconography mixed with signs unknown to this investigator. Crosses, yes, but inverted. Stars with unusual numbers of points. Words in what may be Latin or perhaps something older. The bedroom told a more disturbing story. 5 straw mattresses lay on the floor, arranged in a semicircle. Each mattress bore dark stains that Dr. Hendricks, who arrived on the 2nd day of the investigation, identified as blood. But not fresh blood, old blood. Blood that had soaked into the straw and fabric over a period of months or even years. On the wall above the mattresses, someone had carved words into the wooden planks. The carving was rough, done with a knife or sharp stone, and the words were barely legible. The seed must be pure. In the corner of the bedroom, the investigators found a wooden crate. Inside were children's clothes, small garments sized for infants and toddlers, but these weren't the clothes one would expect in a home with children. They were stained, torn, and according to Dr. Hendricks' examination, showed signs of having been worn by children with significant physical abnormalities. Some garments had been modified with extra openings or unusual stitching patterns, suggesting they had been adapted for bodies that weren't quite normal. The clothing suggests deformities, Dr. Hendricks wrote in his medical report, dated September 18, 1912. Enlarged skull openings in some caps, unusually wide arm and leg holes in others. Without examining the children themselves, I cannot determine the nature of these deformities, but the modifications suggest systematic abnormalities across multiple infants. But where were these children, and where was the family? The search party expanded their investigation to the surrounding property. In a small clearing about 50 yards behind the cabin, they discovered what appeared to be a makeshift cemetery. 4 wooden crosses, crude and unmarked, stood in a row. The volunteers began to dig. What they unearthed sent shockwaves through the investigation. In shallow graves, no more than 2 feet deep, they found the remains of 4 infants. Dr. Hendricks examined the remains on site, and his findings were documented with clinical precision. All 4 infants had died within the first few months of life. All 4 showed severe skeletal abnormalities. Enlarged skulls with incomplete cranial closure, twisted spines, deformed limbs. 1 infant had what appeared to be polydactyly, extra fingers on both hands. These deformities are consistent with severe inbreeding, Dr. Hendricks noted in his report, the kind of genetic degradation one might see in isolated populations that practice consanguineous marriages over multiple generations. However, the severity of these abnormalities suggests something more immediate and direct than distant cousin marriages. These children were the product of very close blood relations. The implications of this discovery were horrifying, but they raised even more questions. If 4 infants had died and been buried here, how many had been born? Were there surviving children? And most pressing, where was the rest of the Whitlock family? On the 3rd day of the investigation, September 18th, Deputy Coulter made the discovery that would transform the case from tragic to truly nightmarish. While searching the root cellar more thoroughly, he noticed that the dirt floor seemed uneven in one corner. Using a shovel, he began to dig. 3 feet down, he struck something solid, not rock, wood. It was a wooden box, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. The box was sealed with nails and what appeared to be tar. The smell that emerged when they pried it open was overwhelming. Decay, chemicals, and something else that the men couldn't identify. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were more remains. But these weren't the remains of infants, they were the partial remains of older children. The bones suggested ages ranging from 2 to perhaps 5 years old. There were 3 distinct sets of remains, all showing the same types of severe deformities found in the infant graves. But these remains had been processed. The bones had been separated, cleaned, and in some cases carved with the same strange symbols that covered the cabin walls. It appears someone was creating some form of ritualistic display with these remains, Sheriff Dugan wrote. The purpose is beyond my understanding, but the intentionality is clear. These children were not simply buried. They were kept, modified, treated as objects of some dark purpose. In the same buried box, the investigators found something else, a leather-bound journal. The journal was damaged by moisture and partially illegible, but what could be read was written in a woman's hand. The first legible entry was dated March 3, 1911, and began with the words, "My name is Ruth Whitlock. I am 23 years old. I am writing this in secret because I fear we will all die here, and someone must know the truth of what Father has done to us." The discovery of Ruth's journal changed everything. This was no longer just a missing persons case or even a case of child mortality due to inbreeding. This was evidence of systematic abuse, of a family held captive by its patriarch, of horrors that had been unfolding for years in complete isolation. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. What was Silas Whitlock's ultimate purpose? Why the symbols? Why the ritualistic treatment of the dead children's remains? And most urgently, if Ruth was documenting these horrors, where was she now? Where were her sisters? Where was Silas? The investigation was about to take an even darker turn. The journal of Ruth Whitlock, the eldest daughter, became the centerpiece of the investigation. Despite water damage and deterioration, approximately 60% of the entries remained legible. Sheriff Duggan brought the journal to Reverend Blackwood, who had experience with historical documents, to help transcribe and preserve what could be saved. What they read over the following weeks painted a portrait of systematic horror that had been unfolding since Martha Whitlock's death in January 1910. The earliest readable entry, dated March 3, 1911, more than a year after Martha's death, began in the middle of Ruth's account. Cannot continue to remain silent. Mother has been gone for 14 months now, and in that time, Father has become something I no longer recognize. He speaks of visions, of messages, from God that come to him in dreams. He says that we, his daughters, are chosen vessels, that our bloodline must remain pure, untainted by the corruption of the outside world. He quotes scripture constantly, but twisted, wrong. The passages about Abraham and Sarah, about Lot and his daughters, about the preservation of the righteous seed. Ruth's handwriting in these early entries was controlled, educated even, suggesting that despite their isolation, the Whitlock daughters had received some form of schooling. But as the entries progressed, the handwriting became more erratic, more desperate. An entry from June 1911 read, "Clara is with child, father's child. She weeps every night. I tried to help her, tried to find a way for us to escape. But Father has taken all our shoes and hidden them. He watches us constantly. When Abigail tried to run last month, he caught her before she reached the creek. He locked her in the root cellar for 3 days without food. She came out changed, broken. She doesn't speak anymore." The journal documented a systematic pattern of abuse that had begun shortly after Martha's death. Silas, apparently descending into religious mania and paranoia, had begun to view his daughters not as children, but as instruments of what he called divine preservation. He believed that the outside world was corrupted beyond redemption, and that only by keeping his bloodline completely isolated and pure could he ensure salvation. But the true horror lay in what that meant in practice. Ruth documented 4 pregnancies between 1910 and 1912. Clara was the first, becoming pregnant in early 1911 at age 21. Her child was born in October 1911, a girl that Ruth described as wrong from the moment she emerged. Her head was too large, soft, misshapen. She lived for 3 weeks, crying constantly in pain, before God mercifully took her. This was likely one of the infants found in the makeshift cemetery. Abigail was next, pregnant by late 1911. Her child, born in the summer of 1912, survived only 2 days. "The baby could not breathe properly," Ruth wrote. "His chest was deformed, his lungs too weak. Father said it was a test of faith, that we had not prayed hard enough. He made us bury the child ourselves." Ruth herself became pregnant in early 1912. Her entries from this period are the most heartbreaking. "I carry a child that should never exist, a child born of the greatest sin. I pray every night that God will take me before I must bring this creature into the world, but I am too weak to do what must be done myself. Clara watches me with hollow eyes. She knows what I am feeling because she has felt it too." The journal also revealed that Esther, only 16 years old in 1912, was pregnant at the time of the family's disappearance. Young Lily, just 14, had so far been spared. But Ruth wrote with dread that Father has begun to look at Lily the way he looked at the rest of us before he took us. She is terrified. We are all terrified, but there is no escape. The symbols carved throughout the Whitlock cabin were analyzed by multiple experts in the months following the discovery. Reverend Blackwood consulted with professors from the University of Kentucky and even contacted a folklore specialist from the Smithsonian Institution. Their conclusions were disturbing. The symbols were a chaotic mixture of Christian iconography, folk magic, and what appeared to be Silas Whitlock's own invented religious language. Inverted. Crosses suggested a rejection of traditional Christianity, while other symbols matched those found in medieval grimoires and texts on alchemy and mysticism. But the most frequently appearing symbol was one that none of the experts could definitively identify, a circle with 7 lines radiating from the center, with strange characters written along each line. Professor Edmund Thatcher from the University of Kentucky, who examined photographs of the symbols in October 1912, wrote in his analysis, "What we see here is the work of a mind that has created its own theology, a syncretic belief system that draws from multiple sources but ultimately serves a singular, disturbed purpose." The number 7 appears repeatedly. 7 lines, 7 marks, 7 iterations of certain phrases carved into the wood. This likely represents Silas Whitlock's interpretation of his family unit, himself and his 6 daughters, Martha having died. The symbols suggest he viewed himself as a kind of patriarch priest and his daughters as both followers and sacrificial vessels. The Bible found in the cabin provided additional insight. In the margins of certain passages, someone, presumably Silas, had written extensive notes. Next to the story of Lot and his daughters in Genesis 19, he had written, "When the world is corrupted and destroyed, the righteous must preserve the seed by any means necessary. God provides the method through the test of faith." Next to the genealogies in Genesis, he had written calculations, attempting to trace his own family line back to what he believed were pure origins. He had convinced himself that the Whitlock bloodline was special, chosen, and that diluting it with outsiders would be an unforgivable sin. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, an early psychiatrist who reviewed the case materials in 1913, provided what may be the most accurate assessment of Silas Whitlock's mental state. This is a case of religious psychosis combined with extreme paranoia and what we might term moral insanity. The subject has constructed an entire theological framework to justify acts that his own moral upbringing would have once condemned. The isolation of the family, the death of his wife, and perhaps an underlying predisposition toward mental instability created the perfect conditions for this descent into madness. He truly believed he was acting in accordance with divine will. But belief, however sincere, did not excuse what Silas Whitlock had done. And it did not answer the central question: what happened to the family in September 1912? The last legible entries in Ruth's journal were dated September 10th through September 13th, 1912, just days before Thomas Pritchard's discovery of the abandoned cabin. These entries were the most frantic, written in a hand that shook with either fear or physical exhaustion. September 10th. Something has broken in Father. 2 more babies have died in the past 3 months. Mine was born in July, lived for 6 days. I was grateful when God took her because I could not bear to watch her suffer. Father grows more violent. He no longer speaks of preservation. He speaks of purification through fire. He has begun burning things, mother's clothes, our books, anything he deems corrupted. Last night he stood in the yard with a torch, staring at the cabin, and I heard him say, "Perhaps we must all burn to be made clean." September 11th. Esther went into labor today. The baby came early, and it was... I cannot write what it was. Father took it immediately to the root cellar. We heard him down there for hours, chanting, carving. Clara has stopped eating. Abigail rocks back and forth and speaks to people who are not there. Lily clings to me and begs me to save her. But I cannot even save myself. September 12th. Father announced tonight that the time has come. He will not explain what he means, but he has gathered us all and made us kneel while he prayed for hours. His prayers make no sense anymore. He speaks in tongues, or perhaps in madness. He has collected all the knives, all the tools, and locked them away. I am hiding this journal in the cellar, beneath the box where he keeps the I cannot write it. If someone finds this, know that we were prisoners. Know that we wanted to live. Know that what happened here was not our sin, but his. September 13th. This will be my last entry. Father has told us that tomorrow at dawn we will be cleansed. He has prepared something, some ritual. I can smell kerosene throughout the cabin. Clara understands what this means. She held me tonight and whispered, "At least we will finally be free." I do not know if she means free from Father or free from life itself. I have tried to think of a way to escape, but he watches us even in our sleep now. If you find this journal, if you find our remains, please tell the world what he did to us. Please let our story be a warning. Evil does not always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes it comes from those who should love us most. Sometimes it wears the face of a father. There were no entries after September 13th. The journal simply ended, leaving investigators to piece together what happened in the final hours before the family vanished. The evidence suggested fire had played a role. The acrid smell Pritchard reported, the chemical odor, was consistent with kerosene. Scorch marks were found on the cabin's interior walls, particularly concentrated in the bedroom area. But curiously, the cabin had not burned down. The fire, if there had been one, had been contained or extinguished before it could consume the structure. This raised a chilling possibility. Had Silas attempted to burn his daughters alive as part of his final purification ritual, only to have something interrupt the process? Had the daughters fought back? Had Silas changed his mind at the last moment? Or had something else, something the investigators couldn't explain, prevented the final horror? The volunteers searched the surrounding forest for days, looking for bodies, for signs of flight, for any indication of where 7 people could have gone. They found nothing. No tracks leading away from the property. No disturbed earth suggesting mass graves. No bodies in the creek or the surrounding ravines. It was as if the Whitlock family had simply ceased to exist on the morning of September 14, 1912, leaving behind only questions, horror, and the lingering smell of kerosene and madness. The Whitlock case was officially closed in 1915 as an unsolved disappearance, but the story refused to die. Over the following decades, fragments of information would surface, each adding new layers to the mystery and deepening the horror of what had occurred in those isolated Kentucky mountains. The first significant discovery came in 1954, 42 years after the family's disappearance. A forestry surveyor named Robert Halloway was mapping timberland in Harlan County when he stumbled upon the old Whitlock property. The cabin, abandoned for over 4 decades, had fallen into severe disrepair. The roof had partially collapsed, and vegetation had begun to reclaim the structure. Halloway, curious about the obviously old homestead, began exploring the ruins. In what remained of the bedroom, underneath a pile of rotted timber and leaf debris, he found a metal lockbox. The box was rusted, but intact, and inside were several items that had somehow survived the decades. A tintype photograph, several letters, and a small leather pouch. The photograph, now housed in the Harlan County Historical Society, shows 6 women and 1 man standing in front of the Whitlock cabin. The image is dated on the back, Summer 1909. This was the Whitlock family 1 year before Martha's death, 1 year before the nightmare began. The women are arranged by height, clearly the mother and 5 daughters. They wear simple dresses and serious expressions, typical of photographs from that era. Silas. Whitlock stands to the side, slightly apart from his family, his hand resting on a rifle. His face is stern, his eyes intense, even in the faded image. But it's the daughters who draw the viewer's attention. Ruth, Clara, Abigail, Esther, and young Lily all stare at the camera with expressions that seem, in retrospect, to carry a haunting prescience. Or perhaps that's simply what we project onto them, knowing what we now know about their fate. The letters in the lockbox were correspondence between Martha Whitlock and her sister Agnes Cobb, who lived in Virginia. The letters, dated between 1906 and 1909, revealed tensions in the Whitlock household even before Martha's death. In a letter dated November 1908, Martha wrote, "Silas has become increasingly difficult. He speaks of isolation as virtue and sees sin in every interaction beyond our family. He has forbidden the girls from attending church socials and grows angry when I suggest they might benefit from knowing other young people. I worry about their futures, Agnes. I worry they will never know life beyond this mountain." In another letter from March 1909, Martha's concerns had deepened. "Silas destroyed your last letter before I could finish reading it. He says correspondence with the outside world invites corruption into our home. I write this in secret and will have Thomas Pritchard post it during his next visit. I fear what will happen to the girls if anything should happen to me. Silas's love for them has become... I do not have words for it. The way he looks at them sometimes, especially at Ruth and Clara, as they've grown into young women, fills me with unease. Promise me, Agnes, that if something should happen to me, you will try to reach the girls. Promise me you will not let them remain isolated with him." This letter was never sent. It remained in the lockbox, suggesting Martha may have hidden it there, perhaps planning to send it later, before her death intervened. The leather pouch contained something even more disturbing, a collection of small bones, later identified by forensic experts as human finger bones from an infant. They had been carefully cleaned and arranged in the pouch, along with small pieces of paper bearing those same strange symbols found carved throughout the cabin. This suggested that Silas's ritualistic behavior with the remains of the deformed infants had been even more extensive than the initial investigation revealed. The discovery of the lockbox prompted renewed interest in the case. In 1955, the Louisville Courier-Journal published a feature article titled "The Vanished Family of Harlan County," which brought the story to a wider audience. The article prompted several individuals to come forward with information. An elderly woman named Sarah Mullins, who had been a young girl living in Cranks in 1912, contacted the newspaper with a troubling memory. She recalled that on the morning of September 14, 1912, the same day Thomas Pritchard discovered the abandoned cabin, she had been gathering herbs in the forest with her mother. At dawn, they heard what Sarah described as the most terrible screaming I ever heard in my life, coming from the direction of the Whitlock place, miles away. Multiple voices, women and girls screaming in terror and agony, and then sudden silence. Sarah's mother had wanted to investigate, but the distance and the treacherous terrain made it impossible to reach the Whitlock property quickly. By the time word of the family's disappearance spread and the search party arrived days later, whatever had caused those screams had long since passed. Another account came from Daniel Whitlock, a distant cousin of Silas who lived in Tennessee. In 1956, Daniel revealed to a local historian that he had received a disturbing letter from Silas in August 1912, just weeks before the disappearance. The letter was rambling and incoherent, filled with biblical quotes and strange declarations. One passage read, The blood must consume itself to be purified. The seed that is planted in corrupted soil will yield corrupted fruit, but the fruit, once harvested, can be returned to the soil to cleanse it. Do you understand, cousin? The circle must be completed. The seven must become one, and the one must return to nothing, and from nothing purity will emerge. Daniel admitted he had been deeply disturbed by the letter but had taken no action, assuming Silas was simply experiencing the eccentricities common to isolated mountain folk. He had lived with the guilt of his inaction for decades. In 1978, a graduate student from Eastern Kentucky University named Patricia Hensley conducted an oral history project focused on Appalachian folklore and legends. While interviewing elderly residents of Harlan County, she encountered several individuals who spoke of the Whitlock property as cursed or haunted. James Tucker, who was 89 years old in 1978 and had been a young man during the time of the disappearance, told Hensley, "Nobody goes near that place. Not then, not now. After they found what they found in 1912, the county tried to auction off the property for unpaid taxes, but nobody would bid on it. There's stories about lights seen in those woods at night, about the sound of babies crying where no babies should be. Some folks say the Whitlock girls never left. They say their spirits are trapped there, reliving their suffering forever." Another interviewee, Mary Catherine Reynolds, age 82, shared an even more unsettling account. "My grandmother worked as a midwife in these parts. She told me that in the summer of 1912, a few months before the family disappeared, a young woman came to her door in the middle of the night. She was thin, pale, terrified. She begged my grandmother for medicine that would end a pregnancy that should never be. My grandmother, being a God-fearing woman, refused and tried to convince the girl to tell her what was wrong, but the girl fled into the darkness. My grandmother always believed it was one of the Whitlock daughters. Though she could never be certain, she carried the guilt of not helping that girl for the rest of her life." These fragments, scattered across decades, painted a picture of a family's suffering that had been visible to the community, if only in glimpses, but that no one had been able or willing to stop. The isolation of the mountains, the culture of non-interference in family matters, and the sheer incomprehensibility of what was occurring had all contributed to a tragedy that might have been prevented, but they still didn't answer the ultimate question. What happened to the Whitlock family on September 14th, 1912? Where did 7 people go, and why was there no trace of them? More than a century has passed since the Whitlock family vanished from their isolated cabin in the mountains of Harlan County, Kentucky. Despite extensive investigations, renewed interest over the decades, and countless theories, the ultimate fate of Silas Whitlock and his 5 daughters remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in American history. The evidence we have is substantial. Ruth's journal documenting years of systematic abuse, the graves of deformed infants born of incest, the symbols suggesting religious mania, the scorch marks indicating an attempted fire, and the testimonies of those who heard screams on that September morning. But evidence of what happened is not the same as evidence of where they went. 3. Primary theories have emerged over the years, each with its own compelling elements and troubling gaps. The first theory suggests murder-suicide followed by concealment. Proponents of this theory believe that Silas, in his final act of madness, killed his 5 daughters in some ritualistic manner, possibly in the root cellar or in the surrounding forest, and then took his own life. The bodies, according to this theory, were hidden in a location that has never been discovered, perhaps in one of the many caves that honeycomb the Appalachian Mountains, or in a deep ravine that was subsequently filled in by natural erosion and vegetation. The screams Sarah Mullins reported would support this theory, representing the final moments of the daughters' lives. However, this theory fails to explain why no bodies or remains have ever been found, despite extensive searches, and why there was no blood evidence beyond the old stains already present in the cabin. The second theory proposes that the daughters, pushed beyond endurance by years of abuse and facing what Ruth's journal suggests was an imminent purification by fire, somehow overpowered their father and escaped. In this scenario, they killed Silas, possibly in self-defense, hid his body, and fled to start new lives elsewhere under assumed identities. This would explain the absence of bodies and the sudden, complete disappearance of all family members. The 5 daughters, ranging in age from 14 to 24, could potentially have made their way to distant cities where they would be unknown. However, this theory requires us to believe that 5 traumatized young women who had lived their entire lives in extreme isolation and had recently given birth to children who died would have had the resources, knowledge, and strength to not only kill their father, but also successfully disappear and maintain their secret for decades. It also doesn't explain the scorch marks or the chemical smell reported by Thomas Pritchard. The third, and perhaps most disturbing theory, is that Silas successfully carried out his final ritual. According to this interpretation, he set fire to the cabin with his daughters inside, but the fire, rather than simply killing them, somehow consumed them so completely that no remains were left behind. He then either perished in the flames himself or fled and died somewhere in the vast wilderness. This theory is supported by the kerosene smell, the scorch marks, and Ruth's final journal entry mentioning the smell of kerosene throughout the cabin and her expectation of a dawn cleansing. However, forensic experts have consistently stated that a fire hot enough to completely consume 6 adult bodies and leave no trace would have also destroyed the cabin entirely, which clearly did not happen. Some local folklore has added a 4th supernatural explanation, that the land itself, corrupted by the sins committed upon it, somehow swallowed the family whole, that they passed into some dark realm as punishment or escape. While this theory has no basis in evidence, it speaks to the psychological impact the case has had on the region. The Whitlock property remains abandoned to this day. Even after it reverted to state ownership, no development has occurred there. Local residents still speak of it with unease. What we know for certain is this: a family that should have been protected by its patriarch was instead systematically abused, imprisoned, and subjected to horrors that most of us cannot fully comprehend. Young women who should have lived full lives filled with possibilities instead suffered in isolation, became mothers to children who were doomed from conception, and ultimately vanished without ever experiencing justice or freedom. The Whitlock case stands as a dark testament to what can occur when isolation, mental illness, religious fanaticism, and unchecked patriarchal power converge. It reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones in our nightmares, but the ones that can exist in seemingly ordinary families, hidden behind closed doors in places where no one is watching. To this day, no one knows the full truth of what happened in those final hours at the Whitlock cabin. The mountains keep their secrets well, and perhaps, given the horror of what we do know, some mysteries are better left unsolved. What do you think happened to the Whitlock family? Do you believe they escaped, or did they meet a darker fate on that September morning in 1912? Share your theories in the comments below. If this story affected you the way it affected me, please subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell to join our community as we continue to explore the darkest corners of history. And remember, the past is never truly dead. It whispers to us from abandoned cabins, from unmarked graves, from journals hidden in root cellars, reminding us that evil is not always distant or abstract. Sometimes it happens in places just like this, to people who had no voice and no escape. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember that history's darkest chapters deserve to be told, if only to honor those who suffered in silence. Thank you for watching.